Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our new study in Moral Laws by Edgar Sheffield Brightman, published in 1933, 9 years prior to his philosophy of religion and spiritual life. But it's a great introduction to Brightman's philosophy, and we take a look at Chapter 2 of A Christian Philosophical Ethics. A Christian Philosophical Ethics. In Chapter 1, we got a chance to look at the dialectic, the three moments of the dialectic that make up this Christian philosophical ethics. And now we look at where does moral law fall within the overall governing of all of creation? Where does moral law fall in the structure of the governing of creation by the divine spirit? Where does moral law find its place? So we look at structure in this lesson. It's going to be Chapter 2, it's going to be pages 33 to page 55. Let's begin by taking a look at Block 1. And we're going to look at types of law. We look at the Greek nomos for custom. And civil law is sanctioned social custom. It has as its aim the protection of life and of property and social cooperation. It is guided by moral principles, and the moral level of any community is expressed as public opinion. It does require moral insight. It is universal in principle, though not in actuality, but it is universal in principle. Next, Brightman takes a look at religious law. He says there are two forms of religious law: ecclesiastical law and theological ethics. Ecclesiastical law is of a given church to govern its members. Theological ethics is the statement that a dogmatic moral law is derived from a religious law. So it posits itself above moral law by stating that it is obedience to God and divine revelation. God is supreme legislator, and this religious law is of supreme importance to society. But the theological ethics that Brightman is mentioning here is the church theology as dogmatic. Church theology as dogmatic. Because moral law is not going to be dogmatic per Brightman. But this is ecclesiastical theological dogma. On Block 2, he continues with the types of law. He looks at natural law. It's impersonal and above all human decision. It is a formulation of fact, a formulation of the causal principles within nature. Then there is logical law. There are three foundational axioms for logical law: the law of identity, the law of contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. These are the rules of consistent thought. Logic is a normative science. Logic is the ethics of thought. And then we come to moral law. Now, moral law must be understood from Brightman's unique perspective. It is the universal principle which a self is obligated to be in conformity with. It consists of principles that are universal and obligatory. Universal and obligatory and dynamic, I would add. For Brightman, it's principles that are universal, obligatory, and dynamic. I'm going to add that. I didn't put it in print, but I'm going to add that also. And by dynamic, I mean non-dogmatic. So moral law are those universal principles, those obligatory principles from the realm of spirit, from the spiritual life of the living religion of Christianity. They are the universal and the obligatory and the dynamic. And from here, we want to move on and take a look at moral law and where it falls within the structure of all these different types of law. So we move down to Block 3, and in Block 3, we're going to take a look at the criticisms against moral law. And number 1, absolute accuracy is an impossibility. It is stated. But Brightman says experience includes facts and rational evaluation. Therefore, pursuit of the ideal is a possibility because we're looking at the conscious, rational evaluation, not just brute fact. Number 2, logic is too constrictive for moral law. Brightman responds and says, but moral law will take into account the individual character of life. It will not presume only one type of character. It will take into account individual character of life. Third criticism, sociology has eliminated the presuppositions of moral law. Brightman responds, but identity is not static and a static entity. For moral law, individual differences in personality will be taken into consideration. Again, differences in personality are considered under moral law, says Brightman. He says there are commonalities for the 5 law types discussed. They're all universal in some way. They're all reasonable. They all conform to logic. They are all sanctioned by an authority. They are all capable of being disobeyed except for nature. So, how does moral law fit structurally within the movement of all these different types of law? How does moral law fit? And the key statement is right there in 3a. Moral law abbreviates civil law and religious law. It does presuppose theoretical ethics. There is going to be a dynamic theoretical ethics that will be presupposed. But under the spheres of operation, there is a natural law, which is descriptive, and then the hidden or veiled moral law that is normative, the movement of the Spirit, is also a sphere of our existence. It's veiled behind the descriptive, but there is the presence of the divine, spiritual, normative law, moral law. And moral law is derived from systematizing moral experience of obligation, of Christian obligation, Christian living religion obligation. So I've inserted a triad within the triad. If you look at the bottom right, we can look at the structure that has been given to us by Brightman. And number 1, moral law abbreviates civil law and religious law. Moral law consists of the universal principles of oughtness, and moral duty consists of the demand that an enlightened conscience makes upon the self based on the eidos ideals. Eidos ideals like agape, self-giving, or kenosis in Philippians 2. But it is universal principles of oughtness, and it is moral duty based on the eidos ideals of living religion, which is Christianity. It abbreviates civil law. Civil codes are sets of principles of social expectation that are subject to critique by moral law. And civil duty is a demand from society placed on the self. Now, religious law is ecclesiastical rules set by the church to govern its members, and a theological ethics that is dogmatic assertions based on a claim of revelatory divine authority. Both areas lack universality and are violated continually, says Brightman. Dogmatic theological ethics posits itself above moral law, but the reverse of this is actually the case, says Brightman. Brightman doesn't approve of fundamentalism. Dogmatic fundamentalism cannot posit itself above moral law. Moral law is Christ-centered, dynamic moral law, and it's universal, and an ecclesiastical fundamentalist dogma cannot posit itself above that standard. So moral law abbreviates civil law and religious law. Dogmatic, religious law. And that's why it's important to really understand the fact that civil codes are looked at as a outside demand from society placed on the self. Whereas if you are aligned with the Spirit in living religion, you should have the enlightened conscience of moral law that will guide your moral duty in conforming to the eidos ideals given in the revelation of living religion. Ideals like agape, self-giving, or Philippians 2, kenosis, emptying of the self for the benefit of the kingdom. Those are just some examples off the top of my head. So it's really important to understand here that having given us a dialectic, and it is the dialectic of the logic of faith, the dialectic of ethics is identical to the dialectic of the logic of faith. It is experimental positing, it is outgoing praxis, trying to actualize ideals, and then it is constructive, interpretive construction in order to refine our understanding of the spiritual kingdom, the spiritual kingdom of Christianity. So it is experimental positing, outgoing desire, and interpretive construction. And in that way, we construct moral law, universal moral principles. Where do they fit? Well, that has to be the standard of what we do in society. That has to be the standard of what we do in church. That has to be the standard. It has to be a standard of the logic of faith creating universal moral principles, all arranged in a system that can be posited as a thought picture or our view of kingdom. So we get a chapter 2 lesson on the positioning structure of the place for moral law. So now we've got a great beginning. Chapter 1 gave us the logic of faith, the three moments, and now we have the place. We've got the logic and the place, and we're ready to proceed on to chapter 3 next time.